Panpsychism is the view that consciousness exists at the most fundamental level of reality. Perhaps even electrons and other fundamental particles have some kind of primitive experience. But even if consciousness isn't everywhere, panpsychism seems to be. From Joe Rogan to Alex O'Connor to Lex Fridman, it's certainly all over YouTube. So today I've brought together an incredible panel of philosophers who all specialize in the philosophy of consciousness to offer some much needed pushback. So joining me, we have Josh Weisberg, professor of philosophy at the University of Houston. We've got Rich Brown, professor of philosophy at CUNY Graduate Center, New York, and Ken Williford, professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Arlington. So, Josh, why don't we start with you? What is panpsychism? Did I get the definition right?
It sounded right to me, but I know that there are panpsychics out there who cut things very finely. But broadly, yeah, consciousness is fundamental, so it can't be broken down into anything smaller. And it's everywhere. Because of that, in a sense, it's everywhere. Because, you got to put it somewhere, so put it everywhere. It's what I think. Because they don't like it to emerge magically sort of in the middle, in media res. They want it to be like fundamental, already there, and so it's everywhere and not emergent. And that's the idea, as I understand it.
Why don't we go around before we play? We've got some clips that I've cobbled together from Alex O'Connor and Galen Strawson, Philip Goff. So before we play those clips, why don't we go around and just offer some few thoughts on panpsychism? What do you think are some of the problems with it? Because whenever we hear it on YouTube, we don't generally hear what the problems are, or at least they're not unpacked in great detail. So, Rich, why don't we start with you?
Oh, all right. Thanks. So first, I guess I would just point out that panpsychism has been around for a very long time in human thinking. And in fact, many of the great psychologists and scientists of the past had something like a panpsychist view, if you read what they wrote. So it's been very popular. Idealism, panpsychism, these kinds of views have been very popular in various traditions through history. So they're kind of making a resurgence currently in a very specific form that you were mentioning earlier about electrons. That's kind of the Russellian version of it. That's kind of the modern contemporary take. So the first thing I would want to say is that these ideas have a history and they're taken seriously. So I wouldn't want to dismiss them just out of hand as being something not worth taking seriously. I think they are interesting, worth exploring. Serious people have held these ideas. But there's still a question about whether you ought to hold these views or whether they are as motivated or as supported as some people may lead you to believe. And so in my mind, the very first and foremost problem with panpsychism is that it doesn't address the central problem that it advertises itself as trying to address. And by that, I just simply mean that the only motivation for thinking that some kind of view like this is going to be true is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And I just don't think that the panpsychist approach makes any progress on that. And instead, there is a kind of hand-waviness to what follows, and then you get exactly the same problems, identical in their nature and scope, as you had before. And then we're told that this is some kind of progress, though, because they're talking about consciousness. So that's, to me, in my mind, all of the technical stuff that you can talk about, it kind of falls to one side when you kind of realize, like, the thing that you told me we could understand, namely, why is it that this particular physical state is associated with any kind of conscious experience in particular, let alone this one? It doesn't seem that they give you any answer to that question. So that's, to me, an uncashed check, which they would, well, yeah, I would like them to cash it.
Right. So just to clarify, so just to be clear, everyone in the audience knows what we're talking about. So would it be right to say the hard problem is basically the problem of why, is whatever you think explains consciousness gives you consciousness? Like, let's suppose you're a materialist and you say, okay, consciousness is this pattern of neurofirings and pain is that pattern and, pleasure is that pattern. You're like, well, why is it that? Why is it accompanied by subjective experience? Why doesn't it not all just go on in the dark? Is that a good description of the hard problem?
Well, I would say that's a generic way of putting the hard problem. The sort of way that I was invoking it was the question of explaining why any particular physical state is associated with the conscious experience that it is. So if you have a certain pattern of neural activity, it's correlated with the experience of pain, then the question would be explain why that pattern is correlated with pain as opposed to some other kind of conscious experience like seeing red or no conscious experience at all. So I do think that if you just merely put it in terms of why is there conscious experience at all, then you get the illusion that maybe there's an explanation. Oh, because consciousness is at the fundamental level. But even there, I would say you don't really get the explanation, which is sometimes advertised, like the explanation for why it is that the kind of consciousness that we have, the kind of experience that I enjoy, is associated with the states in my brain that it is. And that to me is what really motivates the hard problem of consciousness, at least in my terms, is that I want to know why the brain functioning in this way as opposed to that way would be associated with any kind of conscious experience, yes, but also this particular kind. And there, I don't think you get any advance. All you get to say is, well, there's consciousness, so something. And that doesn't seem to me to be rising to the level of something serious enough to motivate a rejection of physicalism.
Right. Ken, what about you?
Well, I kind of like to say that, well, a couple of things. I don't really buy the arguments for consciousness fundamentalism. And by that, I mean views that take consciousness to be a fundamental feature of reality that isn't composed or realized in features that are non-mental or non-conscious. So, and those arguments tend to be like the conceivability argument, the zombie argument, the knowledge argument, then a few, the explanatory gap argument. And I think that none of those really, at the end of the day, work as arguments for fundamentalism. And I have argued myself that they all rest upon thinking that we know sort of the essence of consciousness by some kind of introspective process. In fact, Philip Goff is quite clear about this. That's basically his view, the revelation thesis. So we can know the full essence of consciousness just introspectively. And if you think that, then yeah, you can rule out that it's realized in your brain and that it could be computational or neurocomputational. And then you're kind of left, well, like, what could it be? Well, it must be fundamental then, because I don't really find anything else. So I don't buy the arguments for consciousness fundamentalism. And panpsychism is one species of consciousness fundamentalism. There's also substance dualism and, idealism. And then on the flip side, I think it's reasonable to think that consciousness has a specific set of functions that it allows an organism to perform, like navigate a ambient space from a point of view, coordinate all of its movements with, just for example, coordinate its movements with that point of view and how the world appears to it from that point of view. Panpsychists, it seems to me, are committed to basically giving up the idea that consciousness has a specific function. And there are a couple of varieties. Some basically think it has no function whatsoever. It's just kind of, a pervasive feature of the universe or of the physical world. And then others think that, no, it actually does everything because it's like the causal substance of reality. And so it's either like it does nothing or it does everything. Yeah. So if consciousness doesn't have some specific set of functions that it performs, that kind of rules out the possibility of testing anything for consciousness or adjudicating between different theories of consciousness. And it seems to me that's what they're committed to, but it seems to me that's a very high price to pay.
Well, I share, similar worries, but specifically for me, I am the guy who makes Galileo's error. I'm that guy. I think Galileo's error is the best move ever made in all of epistemology or something. sort of thinking about reality in mathematical and causal functional terms, I just think it's highly premature to think, well, we're done with that. Couldn't go any farther. And now we move to panpsychism or dualism or some kind of radical move. My own view is that that's pessimistic about the possibilities of explaining things in the same terms we use to explain biological heredity in life and other things that seemed like great problems not even that long ago. I'm not saying that this is the same problem. I'm not saying there aren't different features here, but it seems to me that the explanatory space is much greater than I think people anticipate here, and it has a track record. If you don't use this method, you're talking about, this stuff that can't be functionalized or mathematized or whatever you want to say. We don't really know what to say about it. It's primitive. That's it. You're sort of done. And that's sort of the thing Richard was saying. We've given up on the problem, but also we've detached ourselves from the methods that have been really successful for about 400 plus years. And it seems to me that it's just premature to do that. We don't know how the brain works in functional terms yet. That'd be a little thing, right? A few billion neurons churning away. We know it's not that. Really? So for me, I just think that they're jumping the gun here. Give us a couple thousand years of work or something from the paradigm that has been successful in lots of other areas. That doesn't mean it's guaranteed. It's fallible, but that for me is the biggest problem here.
Right. And just, can you recap, not everyone's read Galileo's error. So can you tell us what was, Goff alleges that Galileo made this error, and that's the name of his book. But what was the error?
Yeah. So I want to go on the record and say, I'm not sure I've really read the book per se.
Yeah, Josh is making an error right now, actually. Because Galileo's error, according to Goff, was that you mathematize everything, but he takes consciousness out and mathematizes everything else except consciousness. Therefore, it's a mistake to think that those methods will apply to consciousness too. Yeah. And kind of the book is aimed at exactly your attitude. I'm not wanting to support it here, but the book is trying to undermine exactly that attitude, that if we just give enough time, those same methods will apply here. And Goff's basic diagnostic of everything here is that it won't work because the methods were never designed to address something like that in the first place. And so I think that's the kind of key move that he wants to make, is there's something fundamentally different here. And that, I think, still your point applies, Josh. So even though, you might be wrong about the book, your point is not wrong.
So like Richard said, the idea is somehow whatever this, the foundations of modern science is the book of nature is written in mathematics, and that's a paraphrase of what Galileo says or something like that. And that leads to Newton and other great triumphs that then incorporate more and more of the universe and more of the complex things in the universe under that heading by reducing it to smaller bits that are mathematizable and so forth. And the moment that Galileo did that, and people like Descartes, they saw that it didn't look like consciousness was anything like that. So they kicked it, they kind of kicked the can down the road. They just said, well, they became dualists. They just said, well, it's something else. But in the long, the 400 years since then, more and more things have become incorporated under that broadly mathematizable picture. And one of the big breakthroughs, of course, is, thinking about thinking in terms of computer science and computation and things that I don't know if Descartes and company would have thought there could be a machine that can do what the computers do now. They would have put that into the hopper of unsolvable dualism. And now we don't think so. We now have carved off just the pure experiential part, or the qualities that really, and it's getting more narrow. To me, that's progress. And so I'm just saying, let's keep going and see how far we can get. Maybe we'll hit a wall, Now, anyway. So yeah, but thank you, Richard, for having read the book. I rely on Richard to do the research.
I'm going to quote the
all the reading for the group.
Let's quote the book, because there's something he alleges against materialism. By the way, if people don't know, I made a movie with many top philosophers and neuroscientists defending materialism or physicalism in philosophy of mind. So do check that out. We cover a lot of the arguments like Mary's room and so on and so forth. But let me cover. I don't know that we covered this particular argument. It's from Galileo's error, Philip Goff. Those who don't know, Philip Goff is one of the main defenders of Panpsychism. If in fact you don't know, you've been living under a rock, because he seems to get himself on absolutely every podcast there is. But let's give a little quote from him. Quote: "Physical science tries to give a purely objective characterization of reality, a characterization that can be grasped by anybody regardless of his or her perspective. To say that reality can be exhaustively described in such terms is to say that there are no subjective experiences, no feature reality that can be grasped only from a certain perspective. Conversely, to say that there are subjective properties which by definition can be grasped only from a certain perspective, is to say that reality cannot be exhaustively described in purely objective terms. Materialists who claim both that reality can be exhaustively described in the objective vocabulary of physical science and that there are subjective properties are quite simply contradicting themselves." So let's get some thoughts on that quote before we go to the video clips. Rich, why don't we start with you?
This is something that kind of annoys me. You can define anything that you would like to be contradictory, and then say, look, people are committed to these contradictory things, and that's great. So in effect, that's what's been done here. But of course, physicalism is just a view. Physicalism is just a view that everything is physical, or in this particular case, that the mind is physical. The claim that it can be exhaustively described in the language of physics is a very modern claim, which is usually foisted on the physicalists by the opposition, by the way. So to say that it can be exhaustively described objectively does sound as though you can't describe something subjective in those terms, since you're trying to exhaustively describe it. And exhaustively means including everything in such a way that you don't leave anything out. And if that's the way you define what physicalism is, then you've sort of defined out the possibility of it being true. In the same way that people like Goff is a prime candidate as well, doing it from the other direction, defining phenomenal concepts in terms of their transparency. In other words, in terms of their revealing the essential nature or essence of that thing which you happen to be checking out, like your conscious pain, such that you define it in such a way where it seems almost impossible for it to be a physical thing. So I do think there's a kind of underhandedness here in the definitional setup, and that you have to be very careful, especially with analytical philosophers, when they're dealing with something like this, because they can become quite enamored with the way they've defined things, and then they think they're just following out a chain of implication, a chain of logic or inference, and there's no funny business. But really, all the stacking of the cards have been done at the very beginning when they say you're committed to this. So I just would deny. I don't think that we, those friendly to physicalism, should give up the idea that consciousness is subjective, or that it powerfully seems so. I think that is just anyone who's like around has to deny it. Can't deny that. That just seems. But there, people will try to do that because they don't want to be committed to what they take the implications of to be. I just think, no, this is the way consciousness powerfully seems to be. That's some reason to think maybe it is that way. It does seem subjective, but that by itself can't be any reason for thinking it's not physical. I just don't see, unless you set things up in this definitional way, which is already enough reason to suspect it, I would say. So anyway, yeah, that's where I would start, is questioning the definitions of what these terms are in this way.
Right. Josh, anything else you want to add to that, or should we move on?
I mean, this is a famous sort of dichotomy presented by Thomas Nagel in a 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, where he sets up the subjective and objective as distinct points on the end of continuum. And so if you've got one, you can't have the other. And I don't see any reason to think that that's the right way to think about subjective. We have a point of view. I mean, Ken said it earlier, we have a point of view. We address the world from, we're built that way. And so we're subjects. And so there's the way things appear to us from that point of view. To think that there couldn't also be a description of that in physical terms, whether I agree with Richard too, that, you can make objective into this impossible thing, but let's not. Let's make it whatever science is saying, fine. There could be both true descriptions from both perspectives that line up, which I think is exactly what you want to try to do. And, there's going to be some slippage, and it's not going to be perfectly defined because nothing's perfectly defined. But scientifically speaking, we'll have a story about how we have a point of view in a physical world, and we're physical systems, if we physicalists are right.
Right. Ken, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, depending on what you want to build into a point of view, or what it is to be a subject, and that itself is an interesting and a question with a lot of different views. People have a lot of different views about it. But one thing that seems pretty salient is that we experience the world visually, but not just visually, from a point of view. And we have, we experience kind of an origin and a kind of horizon of experience. And you can get an idea of a kind of objective description of what something like that is by studying projective geometry. Because projective geometry is a framework in which you can define points of view, but the geometry itself is kind of an objective, and in the way that mathematical, systems or mathematical frameworks are objective. That is, we have the clearly defined concepts, we have the relevant relations and axioms, and we can sort of get a sense of what this thing is in an objective way in that sense. So I think there's a little bit of, they need to at the least be much clearer about what it means, what objectivity means here and what subjectivity means here. And there is at least one way in which you can get an objective picture, if you like, of a subjective point of view, at least in terms of the aspects of subjectivity that are captured by projective space, by projective geometry. So,
right. Okay. In fact, that is obviously an obvious gambit for a plug to Ken's own model of consciousness. Yeah, projective consciousness model. And, lo and behold, we have a video about that. So if you go onto our channel, there's a whole video with Carl Preston.
This was unscripted, by the way. We're not.
Yeah.
But
plug your own models if you have one. Right. Okay. Now, I was thinking we'll go onto the clips now, but oh my God, we've gone around the room about problems for panpsychism and nobody mentioned the combination problem. So why don't we explain that? Rich?
In the most basic form, the combination problem is just the question of how do the little tiny consciousnesses combine to my kind of consciousness, or the question of how it is that if you think that the fundamental nature of particles, for example, electrons, is consciousness, but of a very different kind than mine, then you need some kind of explanation for how that combines into mine. And there may be subdivisions of that. Chalmers likes to divide this up into several like the palette problem and so forth. So, like, what are exactly the microphenomenal properties? By the way, that's also what they get called often is microphenomenal properties of what it's like properties of the micro subatomic level or something like that. So that's generally the combination problem. I think it's clearly a disguised version of the heart problem all over again. The question just is, how do you explain how consciousness arises? And postulating the combination problem just reveals once again, that just merely saying, oh, there's consciousness at the fundamental level doesn't advance the discussion in any way at all. It leaves you right back at the beginning, scratching your head, asking, wait a minute, explain. And then you get the same question. How does consciousness like mine arise from the functioning of the brain? And I think the problem's even more kind of put sharply into focus when you realize, oh, there's lots of processing in the brain, or exactly in that table over there, which there's no conscious experience, but the elements are the same. So you really do need the same kind of explanation, which the physicalist is likely to give. And often panpsychists will say, oh, well, we'll just appeal to the phys. Like it could be IIT, it could be global workspace, right? But then you're just, well, in my opinion, that's a bit cheating because all the hard work is being done by the science and you're surveilling yourself without putting skin in the game, making any predictions like some of us like to do. But anyway, so I guess that's enough about I don't want to jump the gun too much here, but I would say the combination problem is overhyped in a way because it's really just the same problem over again, given a new name to disguise the fact that we haven't made any progress over the original problem that motivated this whole way of talking to begin with.
There was one thing in the book Galileo's Error, and we had a debate at Oxford recently, and my friend Alex O'Connor mentioned this, but I can't remember if I got this exactly right, but they appealed to the fact that you have split brain patients. So if you sever the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, then you can kind of almost get almost like two different people. And then I think Goff appealed to that, and so did Alex, and saying, well, look, there you go, we can combine consciousness. So, the problem of consciousness, the combination problem is not so bad. Any thoughts on that?
I know that some more recent research has drawn into question sort of the extent really of the severance involved. And there's some evidence that maybe the original Sperry experiments were not done quite well enough, and subsequent experiments and Gazzaniga's experiments and subsequent experiments have shown that maybe that there's not really something we should describe as a split subjectivity. On the other hand, suppose that Sperry and Gazzaniga were right, and you can create two centers of consciousness in one brain by splitting the corpus callosum. Thinking about it as so we can combine the two independent consciousnesses into one consciousness, that may not be the right way to think about it at all. It might be that somehow the conditions are met that create two centers of subjectivity when you sever the corpus callosum. But when you integrate all that information, it's not really combining two consciousnesses. It's just incorporating all that information into one consciousness. So it's not. So just thinking about it as, it's definitely an instance of combining consciousnesses may not be the right way to think about it. So it's kind of so if Sperry and Gazzaniga were right, then it's still inconclusive. It's to use. Everybody likes to use that for their theory. IIT, Tononi has used it. See, it shows that IIT is right. And
can I just chime in on this as well? I was lucky enough to be able to work with Joe Ledoux and wrote a couple of papers with him, and he was working with Gazzaniga way back in the old days, and was able to be there for some of those original experiments, and post as well. So first I would say just about the historical stuff. It's only, well, I'm not going to contradict anything that Ken said, by the way. So I do think I was at a conference at NYU where I saw people making a lot of these same points. It's only really right after the surgery. It's very transient. But the claim about there being two different sides of consciousness, disassociates, whatever, really, people like Gazzaniga and Ledoux only make that claim in specific cases where speech centers are present both in the right and the left hemispheres, where in the most majority of people, speech centers are in the left hemispheres. And so in the traditional case, in the usual typical case, you can ask the person what they saw, and they'll answer that, and that's the left hemisphere telling you. And then to be able to talk to the right hemisphere at all, you have to ask them to point with their left hand, and then they'll point at various things. But Gazzaniga's idea was always that it's the speech centers in the left hemispheres, which are kind of interpreting the behavior in order to alleviate a kind of cognitive dissonance given by the fact that you don't believe consciously that you should be pointing at the thing that you're pointing at. So the whole idea was to think of the right hemisphere as a kind of an unconscious information process, from Gazzaniga's point of view, an unconscious information processor, with the left hemisphere being the kind of conscious agent, if there were one in this scenario. But in some rare circumstances, one of which they reported about, their speech centers on both hemispheres. And in one particular case, they asked this person, what did you want to be as a kid? And they said something like a race car driver or something like that. No, they said a politician. And then they asked to spell with their left hand. Yeah, exactly. They asked to spell with their left hand, and that's when they wrote out the word race car driver. And then they were very surprised by that. And when asked to explain it, they said something like, "Oh, my favorite politician is a race car driver, I think." So the idea was that was the...
One sec. So just in case people don't know, the idea is that one hemisphere does language and the other one, is doing the writing, and that's how you can talk to the different hemispheres. Is that right?
Well, the idea was that in this particular individual, both hemispheres were doing language.
Oh,
So that's how you were able to talk to the right hemisphere, because it was unlike in most people, this particular case, it was able to process speech. And so they could use the left hand to write a word out. But in the typical case, there's no speech centers on the right side. So whatever these split brain persons are doing, assuming this actual split that's occurred is in fact intact, they can't communicate verbally from the right hemisphere. But in some small percentage of cases, they can. And those are the cases which Gazzaniga and Ledoux thought, well, maybe in those cases, there really is two different individuals because there's two different centers of speech, two different verbal reports, in essence. And so that's a very small subset of split brain patients, not the typical case at all, and also very highly controversial, dependent on the idea that that basically consciousness is a kind of interpretation in a sense. And that, by the way, Gazzaniga wrote a book called the Consciousness Instinct, where he actually tries to go through all of this stuff. But so I don't think you can just, a lot of people do, as Ken was saying, appeal casually, offhandedly to cases like split brain, as though there's some kind of unanimous interpretation of these results and that they're all well known, when in fact there's a tremendous amount of controversy. People get the details wrong. It's very messy. People are still debating this. So yeah, I do think that that's not a very good case. And even if it were a good case, then you would just advert back to the earlier comments about how it wouldn't work anyway.
Right. Josh, any last thoughts on the combination problem before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, whatever one wants to say about these controversial and very interesting, I mean, they're super fascinating, the split brain cases, not to, whether philosophers can use them to slot in as perfect, master arguments, but who cares? They're super interesting. But for my money, they're better explained by global workspace or higher order, self-reflection or something in terms of the function of the brain. There's some preserved function and explains why there's certain things. And that tells you nothing about what electrons are adding to the consciousness, which I took to be the more foundational problem in the combination problem. Getting from a brain to some other parts of a brain, that's not so bad. But getting from electrons to, which are a little bit conscious to us, that's still sitting there completely unanswered. Whereas the plausible answer about what's going on in the split brain cases is going to be answered at the neuroscientific level, at the level of these, neuroscientific theories broadly construed. And so I don't get, other than, there's a combining, and then that's all you get. So, anyways, I'm skeptical, but I'm already skeptical. So
I kind of see like a handful of problems here. So there's just the sort of problem of like which combinations are conscious, right? As such, because panpsychists are not all committed to things like, your ballpoint pen is conscious as such, or your piece of paper is conscious as such. Like, what is it like to be a piece of paper? Like, write on me or whatever. It's like, they're not committed to that. But then the question arises like, well, okay, which combinations are, combined to forget? I mean, there's the deeper problem or a more fundamental problem in a way, which is, okay, how do you combine them in the first place? Like here's like a experience of red and an experience of green over there. Like, how do they get green and red like at once? Like, how does that? It's not easy to imagine. But you might ask, okay, so which combinations? And there's not really a good solution to this problem, it seems to me. Certainly not an a priori one. Almost nobody thinks it's unrestricted mereological composition that tracks. So that means
There's at least one person that thinks that.
Who? I mean, not even Spinoza thinks that. Like, so
I think that? Like Luke Roloffs basically thinks that.
Oh, I don't think Luke thinks that.
Yeah, I do.
Luke is Ken's colleague.
He's my colleague. So.
Yeah, ask him. Well, what's the restriction?
We'll get him to answer that. But anyway, go on, Ken.
Okay, but that is the issue. Like, what is the restriction?
Exactly.
So is there a separate conscious agent that is like me and the moon and my glasses? And it's like, yeah, or what is it? What does it feel? And that seems crazy. But then once you say, no, there has to be something restricted. This is why some panpsychists were kind of, maybe they still are, interested in something like IIT as a way to try to say like, this is what's going to underpin the combining into this, this conscious entity versus that one. Okay, so that's one problem. And then there's also the kind of inverse combination problem, which is if you're one of those who thinks that like there's just really one big consciousness, because that's another version of panpsychism. Then the issue is, all right, how do we get me? And then how do we get this one where we seem like to have some kind of separation? And by the way, this problem, the combination problem and the inverse combination problem, were both discussed by Ralph Cudworth in like 1680 something. I forget.
Yeah, exactly.
So and he was a dualist of some sort, but he thought, the panpsychists are crazy.
So it's ironic because I think I've heard many panpsychists say, despite years of research on the brain, we haven't conquered the hard problem of consciousness. But basically, we've had more than 300 years of the combination problem, or we've not had a solution.
That's right.
Touche.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
And then I think the last thing is, whatever you think the story is, whatever accounts for combination and differentiation and so on, you don't want to say that is consciousness doing that. So even if you've got, all the basic things are conscious, you still got something else, something other than those consciousness particles or the whole big that's doing this kind of differentiation and, some kind of structuring behind it. That can't itself just be more consciousness, it seems to me. So even if it seems like you're kind of committed at one level or another to something other than consciousness, even if you think consciousness is fundamental. Well, they might be willing to accept that, but...
Right. All right, so let's go on to the clips. Now, I was going to start with Galen Strawson giving the argument for panpsychism, but given we're talking about
he gives a kind of respectable argument that's very different to the one that we've been talking about from Goff, which is this kind of, I can see it for myself. It's not physical by looking. That's not what Strawson's doing. Strawson's
we're going to come to Strawson's argument in a minute, but I thought, given we're talking about the combination problem, this is probably an opportunity to play a clip from Alex Connor, who talks about the combination problem. So why don't we do that now, and then we'll go on to Galen Strawson.
But the problem is, the materialist has a combination problem too, right? So you want to ask the panpsychist, well, why do you put all of these individual conscious entities together and you get one big unified consciousness? Why does that happen? But I want to say to the materialist, you've got a combination problem too. You take a bunch of inanimate matter and you put it together and it combines into one conscious experience. But you've also got the problem of it combining into like a totally different kind of thing, So that is a problem for panpsychism that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
But I think it's a problem plus some for like a materialist, if you know what I mean. But
all right, Rich, why don't you react to this?
Well, I first of all want to say that I like Alex and the work that he does. I've never met him. I don't know him. So, I don't want to come off as too harsh, but I'm very American.
He's a very good friend of mine, and he's a great guy. He's a really great
I'm
guy.
sure he is, but us Americans.
I think he's a judge. I hate him.
I do think it's kind of, the reason why I want to preface this statement is because I do think the kind of view that there's a way in which some of these popular panpsychists, the way they present the view very closely resembles anti-science, in my opinion. That's like on par with like flat earther level anti-science. And so that sounds like a pretty mean thing to say about someone. I don't, that's why I want to say, look, I don't know him. I'm not trying to be mean. But I do think that sometimes the way that at the popular level, that this is one of the problems, and one of the way I create more criticism of how you do popular philosophy. But the problem here is that he says inanimate dead matter, and you get something completely different. And it's that way of framing the problem that has bagged everything up from the beginning, because that is not what the physicalist is saying. The physicalist is not saying, oh, you start off with some random dead matter and then magic happens and you get something completely different in conscious experience. That is not the view at all. So that way of putting it is not it can't be a problem for physicalism, because that's not what the physicalist is committed to. That's not how the view is put forth. So yeah, I think that. way of
Can you unpack that a bit more? Like, why is that not the view of physicalism? Like, what's wrong with that as a characterization of it?
if you are a physicalist, then what you're saying is that consciousness is a kind of material thing. It's not a completely different thing. It can't be, because it just is a physical thing like everything else. So you don't start off with dead matter and get something completely different. You get something which maybe I would grant has some epistemological properties which make it seem really interestingly different than other things. I do think that from the inside, consciousness seems naively, when you're reflecting on it late at night, just before bed, all that kind of stuff, first reflections before you do any serious work, it does seem like, okay, like, do I really know what the experience of pain is like when I'm having a pain in my ankle? So there is a kind of sense in which consciousness presents itself as saying, yeah, you do actually. It's like this. So I want to grant that. But at the same time, it's really quite a big step from there to that's a completely different kind of thing than anything you started with. That seems to me to be where the game is lost. And how I would object to this way of characterizing the alternative side's problem. But I do think the first part is right, though. I do think that we do owe an explanation. We want some kind of account for why it is that consciousness has the properties that it does, appears the way that it does, can be manipulated. Can we change it in this respect, that respect, by looking at its physical properties? And even more so, I'd say, can we look at the physical properties and come up with some way to a new phenomenological property that you might not have thought of from the inside? By the way, people have already kind of done that, I would say. So I just think that if you start off with framing the problem with there's something magical and that's not physical and therefore it can't be physical, then yeah, of course you're never going to make progress on this problem. But the physicalist is not saying you start off with something magical that's not physical and then you make it physical. That is really a bad way to put the problem.
Right. Ken, any thoughts on this?
Well, I would just add that, there's also some crazy stuff that happens in the indisputably physical realm that you might think, well, that's like something new, like Bose-Einstein condensates and black holes. And so you can go from just standard physical, whatever it is actually, to some pretty wild stuff so it's like, okay, that's a general point on that. And then with respect to consciousness, I would just add that if my choice is between, okay, there's, consciousness is fundamental and widespread, or we simply don't understand something and maybe can't, I would go that route. That's kind of a third Mysterian option that it seems to me. So, the idea is, okay, we come up with an explanation, we come up with a theory that's reductive in a certain sense, that captures the phenomenology and doesn't just, viciously, or doesn't just implausibly eliminate it or deny it. Okay, that would be ideal. And we can have a theory about how it's realized in brains and possibly other substrates. That would be ideal. If we can't do that, and we just simply can't make sense of properties like intentionality and, experience, representation. Mysterianism still seems to be more plausible than just saying, okay, therefore it's fundamental, ubiquitous, and widespread. It's like you're kind of overgeneralizing from this one sort of mysterious thing that you are to putting it everywhere. And that just moves the problem, as we've seen already in this discussion, moves the problems over, doesn't really solve anything, creates a whole bunch of new problems. So that's where I would put my money if the physicalism project doesn't work out. I would be a Mysterian before I would be a panpsychist.
Right. Josh, any last thoughts?
So there seems to be a big thing that Galen and the guy. I'm sorry. What's the guy on the clip? He's Alex. And Alex. Philip Goff. They really don't like emergence. And emergence is that's like, oh no, and they mean by emergence something very, which Richard is pointing out. They get that to be scary by stretching the separating the two things so far apart that lifeless dead matter, the glories of consciousness. It's like, yeah, of course, emergence is going to look bonkers. But that's not at all the way modern science to me has gone. It's been this gradual process of connecting lots of different levels. And lots of kinds of emergence are not spooky at all, and they know it. They do talk about it. Then they try to make this one look different. But, it was thought by people like, the British emergentists in the turn of the 20th century that macrochemical properties couldn't be predicted from atomic properties at all. And C.D. Broad said, a mathematical archangel would not be able to determine the properties of silver chloride. We don't think that anymore. Yeah, that's the way he said it. That's right. And so often what happens is we figure out how things emerge. Indeed, one would think that's the hard problem, with an optimistic vision toward it. Like, oh, we haven't yet figured out how these things emerge. But part of the way that you might get there is by thinking about these intermediate structures at the level of the brain, right? And the level of psychology, and seeing how they might be realized in ways that connect up ultimately with chemical things and stuff. And so emergence to me is sort of just normal practice in science, so long as it's properly connected with theory, and that's the trick. And there's a long history of successfully overcoming things that looked emergent, that turned out to be emergent in this not scary sense. And so what the argument was, oh, we've both got combination problems, but the materialists have emergence. And to me, I'm like, yeah, well, good. That means we explained how it connected. So, I'm not blown away by the worry of emergence.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know if you think this is relevant, but like in physics, you have all these weird equivalences. They're called dualities. So there's this famous one called ADS-CFT, and it says, like an anti-de Sitter space, which is a space with a negative cosmological constant, is equivalent to the boundary of a conformal field theory. These things just, you don't need to know the details of this. The bottom line is they look very, 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 very different. But it turns out they're equivalent, and so why can't different things be equivalent to each other that look different on the surface? I don't see there's
because these are so different, Phil. They're so different. And that's the only way their argument. Yeah, it's so different though. But you're right. Science is full of these, and I love the dualities from string theory as a prime example. I mean, it's good to people haven't really caught up, I would say. Well, not you, but I mean philosophers, with thinking about all the interesting stuff from string theory. So, yes, lots of things that look different can turn out not to be so. Even surprising, like for example, short distances and long distances.
duality. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So it can be very surprising. This is why I think part of the what appeals the anti-science nature of this, the appeal of panpsychism to that sort of branch of stuff is it preserves the specialness of the individual. It's like, first of all, it's got to make sense to me. And if it doesn't, it can't be true. And that way of thinking, I think, underlies a lot of skepticism towards science, where they just, they really feel like it's got to be something that I could intuitively understand, or else it can't be right. And when you say things like, oh, the mind is the brain, or some kind of physicalist theory is right, they're like, but how could that be true? And I just think, well, why does that matter? Why would it matter at all whether you could understand it in order for it to be the case? And that's not the same as Mysterianism, whereas like there's nothing we can understand. It's just to say sometimes science presents nature in such a way that you think to yourself intuitively, how could that be? And yet there's the evidence. And part of the scientific attitude, in my view, is learning how to deal with it. And a lot, and I would also say in quantum theorizing, you get a lot of kind of training for the classical, and searching for some way to reestablish that. And I think that something similar is going on here with respect to consciousness.
So there's the emergence problem that we allegedly have, which is bad. But then they say they have something like an axiom or a fundamental claim: consciousness is real. And when they say that, they don't just mean like what I mean. That's meant to rule me out. Like whatever I'm going to say next that could potentially emerge in a non-spooky way, they already know that's not real. And I hate that part of this program.
I know. I know I'm supposed to watch.
Go ahead, sorry. We're going to get there, but it's already implicit that somehow the distance between the things, the emergent distance, is so great because consciousness is real. And if you make it unreal, sure, of course it'll merge. And so that dynamic is sort of the one that they want to place, that dialectic is the one they want to place us in. Either we've got to have spooky emergence, or we cannot make consciousness real. And I reject both of those. I think emergence is totally fine when done right, and consciousness is real, but it's not packed full of stuff that rejects all of science. So, sorry, I'm getting worked up now.
Oh, well, you're going to get
all
worked
this
up because we're going to listen to Galen Strawson, who is one of the leading panpsychists. I think, was he Philip Goff's PhD supervisor? Is that right?
He was.
Yeah.
I thought Papineau was.
No.
Anyway,
he did work with Papineau. In this book, Galileo's Error, he does talk about working with Papineau, but I think Strawson was his supervisor. So we're going to hear Strawson defend panpsychism. So let's play that clip.
Physics has a description to give of everything in the universe. Second, consciousness is real. Now we have an interim conclusion. Consciousness is wholly physical. Must be, because everything's physical, right? There is no such thing as radical or strong emergence. Step 5, the emergence of consciousness from the wholly and utterly non-conscious would be a case of radical emergence. Therefore, consciousness must in some sense be right at the bottom of things, because you can't, we know it's here, we know it's physical, you couldn't get it out from something wholly and utterly non-conscious, so it must be in some way down at the bottom of things.
So, Josh, this is what you were talking about. Yeah. Now, would I be right to say that the bit I think that I would object to, like most of it, actually, I kind of agree with what he said. It seemed very reasonable. But the bit that I would object to is the bit where he says it's radical emergence.
Yeah,
why is it radical emergence? Is that, am I right?
So the answer is yes. You were right, Phil. And Galen is so good. I love Galen. I think very highly of his work and just as a person. He's a joy to be around. He's very clever, and he's so good, better than I'll ever be at emphasizing a word to give it philosophical import. Radical, it's like, ooh, And so, yeah, you've put your finger right on it.
It might seem that it's radical emergence. Maybe because the brain is so complicated. So no surprise that we don't understand how consciousness might emerge from the brain because it's so unimaginably complicated. But that's nothing to do with the problem with the principle of, the brain-based physicalism. It's just the fact the brain is so goddamn complicated. Is that fair?
Exactly? That's exactly how I would put it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, that's very well put. I was just going to add that, I was a student of Galen's for at least one semester. I took classes with him. He came to the grad center, and I remember I got his book. It was called Real Physicalism or The Mental Reality, or I forget, whatever it was called. And I was very excited by it. I was like, yeah, real physicalism, consciousness, real. Because I honestly, this resonates, and he was very much against illusionism and the looking glassness of taking terms and inverting their meaning. And I was like, yeah, exactly. Like physicalists have to really be owning up to consciousness's existence. It is real. It exists. And then I met him and we had our first conversation and it did not go well because he just meant the literal opposite by all of that stuff that I meant. And he thought that it somehow indicated, and I sort of disagree with the way he does philosophy by quote famous person at you. It's like, well, I have this view. He's like, oh, famous person X says opposite of your view. And I'm like, okay, he's dead. So I guess I win. I don't know. So I'm not really a fan of I have a million famous quotes. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. The point of that I was trying to make was that consciousness is real. It does emerge. And then you say, what about water? And he goes, oh, but that's not radical emergence. That's something else. And then you go, but so why is this radical emergence? It says, because I, Galen Strawson, don't understand how it could emerge. And then you think to yourself, gee, can you hear Aristotle saying exactly that about water when you travel back and try and tell him about H2O? He says, Aristotle, don't understand that. And you go, yeah, and cool. Let's take some science and then come up. So yes, it will always seem radical to you if you start at the wrong place and look for the thing that you're interested in. And if you start at the fundamental level, physics, if you start talking about electrons, and spin and anything at that level, then you're in the wrong place, because consciousness is a feature of the mind. And the mind is a psychological thing. That's the science that studies the mind, is psychology, neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience. That's where you start to look for a theory. You don't start at physics unless you have a really strange, misguided view about how you do things, because the thing you're trying to explain is a psychological thing. I want to understand cows. I want to study animal husbandry and agriculture and biology. I'm not going to study physics, because it's the wrong place to start. So, of course, it will seem radical because you're skipping the whole area where a theory of the thing you're talking about could possibly arise or exist, and stipulating that no such thing could ever count as satisfying me. So therefore, oh well, to the other side. And that way of arguing is just so frustrating that that smart people say it is just so incredibly aggravating to me, that I think there must be something wrong with me at this point, because it really drives me up the wall. I cannot emphasize enough how much it drives me up the wall to hear someone just blithely say, yes, it's radical emergence. And they go, what about that? No, it's not radical, because I understand, I can picture how it would happen. And I just go, wow, it's such a high esteem you have yourself in. It must be nice to have such high esteem of yourself, because I would have thought that my not understanding it could be the farthest thing away from it being true or false. It has nothing to do with it. So yeah, these kinds of things are really frustrating. But still, if something is truly radical, yes, of course, that's a count against it. If it really violates all the stuff that we know about everything else, then that seems strange. But this is a smoke and mirrors setup. So I think you're exactly right. Well, what you were saying is long-winded way of saying I agree with you.
This is like a support group for materialists. Like, they're being, I don't get them. Am I crazy? Is it me? No, you're okay, Richard. We're all with you.
And
my name is Josh. I've been a materialist for 17 years, whatever.
Actually, Ken, why don't you just very, very briefly unpack, what's this difference between weak and strong emergence? And do we need strong emergence to be a materialist?
Well, I think we're all on the same page here. Yeah, emergence that you don't understand is going to look radical, right? It's possible that we for whatever contingent reasons, we'll never be in a position to understand exactly how consciousness emerges. But that wouldn't mean that, metaphysically, it's an instance of radical emergence. It just means, we don't understand something. Maybe we're blocked, right? Maybe we're not. So that's why we keep the project going, right? So this is why I said earlier, if my choice were between panpsychism or some other kind of consciousness fundamentalism and Mysterianism, defined here as the view that we're kind of cognitively blocked to understanding what would, just for contingent reasons, which would allow us to understand the non-radical emergence, then I would go with that view. Just because the kind of common sense plus supplemented by neuroscience and psychology, psychiatry, and so on, the kind of mind sciences, the evidence is it seems to have something to do with your brain in a very, very sensitive ways. You have a stroke and you get Broca's aphasia. Something happened to you, or you take LSD, things start to echo, right? We know that neurotransmitters and or we directly stimulate your brain, and you have. Whereas if we douse your toe in LSD before it crosses your blood, gets into your blood, it gets nothing's happening there or whatever. You know what I mean? There's this overwhelming evidence. This is why we study the brain and relate it to consciousness.
You don't know what it's like to be my toe, man.
Yeah, that's right. And people kind of forget that, you often hear people who are either supporting idealism or panpsychism, like Bernardo Kastrup and others, they come out against, these atheists, materialism has become a dogma and it's blinding people. And people forget that, for centuries, it was just the other way around. It was the dogma were things there are souls and animism and panpsychism and dualism. And it took centuries of work to as Thomas Willis put it, in like he's kind of the father, one of the fathers
Circle
of
of Willis,
neuroscience.
maybe.
Yeah, that by studying the brain we can explain the fits of epileptics. He says, rather than attributing it to the incantations of witches. And well, he was right about that. So it's like, okay, that's it's long, slow, but we did have to like overturn this anti-materialist dogma. There were like few materialists, like there's Epicurus, there's like the Charvaka in ancient India, then there's
Democritus.
Democritus, and then in the early modern period you've got like Hobbes and Gassendi, and but they're like in the minority, and they're always like, oh, those crazy like neo-Epicureans, and that's nonsense, and like everything, including among the famous scientists like Descartes and Newton, and they're all kind of dualists of some sort. So it's been taking a whole lot of work to like get to this position where what's being called, the dogma or whatever, the dogmatic mindset. And it seems like it's a little premature to be saying, oh, the other view was right. So it seems much more likely, given all that overwhelming evidence that had to go into supporting the idea that brains are specially connected with conscious experience as far as our evidence goes. It seems to me that it's more likely, if we don't solve the problem in a way that satisfies us, so we can sort of see the emergence in a clearer way, that it doesn't mean it's not emergent. It just means it's an emergence we haven't understood yet and maybe can't.
Yeah.
But
science moves slow. Yeah. Like people don't recognize. Like, it's funny to think that less than 75 years ago, if you went back in time, you would still find people debating whether synapses are real, whether neurotransmission occurs by whether the neural impulse gets translated into neuromodulators or neurotransmitters, and that the synapse is too slow. People like John Eccles and the famous neuroscientists are saying, no, this can't be right. These not too long ago. So we have really fought long and hard to get to this point, just to echo Ken's point. And it's slow. So to say that this is just a dogma is insulting, first of all. But to say that it's somehow got to be overturned because it's like somehow crushing the true progress is also interesting. But let me final one. I know I've ran one comment though about Mysterianism, because I do think that in the background is a big debate about philosophy of science. And so, for example, a lot of these guys have a view that the way that science works is you're going to sort of a priori be able to deduce from some very small set of base facts everything else. So that Goff tries not to make a big deal about that. Chalmers does, though. And it's sort of in the background of what Galen is saying about radical emergence, that you can't really see how you deduce one from the other. And to that end, I want to say that there's a completely different view about the philosophy of science, which is that identities in science aren't a priori deduced, but are rather postulated to explain other things. And that's a view that I would associate with a more pragmatist approach. But people like Ned Block have argued for it. And it's kind of completely overlooked in the popular debate, in the popular view, because it sort of says, well, you can't explain the identity. Rather, you postulate the identity to explain something else. And so I don't think that's Mysterianism, though. A lot of people will say, oh, it's giving up. You're saying you can't explain it. But the view is that, well, that's just how identities in science work. You never really a priori deduce an identity. You always have these correlations and then go, oh, if these two are the same, then I can explain all that other stuff. And that justifies me for accepting the identity. So that view about how identities are established in science is something that I find very friendly. Like I defend that view. So I do think that it's sort of and I'm not saying you're doing this either, Ken. I'm just saying I want to put a pin there, because it does sound a little bit like you're saying, oh, you can't explain it. Because I'm saying the mind could be the brain and the identity is somehow brute, because all identities are. They're just, that's what identities are, is just they are what they are. And you can't really explain why two things are identical to each other. But that's not a kind of Mysterianism, I would say, because I would associate that with the view that everything else can be explained in this a priori deduction way, except this, which can't, is special. So I just want to mark that distinction, because I do think that in the popular debate, the kind of view that I'm friendly to often gets portrayed as kind of a lesser candidate because people, it does end up saying that, you'll never really understand why this is that way, which is why I kind of harp on this idea. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, by the way. So,
oh, cool.
All right, let's go to the next bit. All right.
Well, what about, say, temperature? An individual atom isn't hot, but if you put a bunch of them together, you get this new thing called heat. Or the wetness of water.
I just say they're not radical. I mean, heat reduces to the motion of these little particles, liquidity. They all reduce smoothly and nicely to wholly physical properties.
I like to point out that in these other examples of emergence, the thing that people are really interested in as having emerged actually emerge as conscious experiences. So like take temperature. You're quite right. Temperature is just the vibration of atoms, right? And if all you mean by temperature is just the sort of motion of atoms, then nothing has emerged when you have a big object that's made of vibrating atoms. But people want to say, oh, but there's this extra thing. When I touch it, it feels hot.
Yeah,
and that's what emerges, without realizing that it emerges as a conscious experience.
All right. So we've, I think, already addressed the issue about the radical emergence and whether it really is radical or not. But why don't we talk about this other issue, like the stuff that emerges as a conscious experience? So any thoughts on that? Josh, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I think he's wrong. Just what I understand, people like C.D. Broad, the British emergentists were worried about liquidity, which is not a property of consciousness. It's a property of chemical substances, of macro substances. So they didn't think you could derive that from atomic structure. So it was atoms doesn't give you liquidity in the world. So I just think he's wrong about the fact. But look, so the basic point is it's radical when we don't get how it works. And it used to be we didn't get how you got from atoms to liquidity in the chemical sense. Hence, the British emergentists were strong emergentists. But to the point about conscious experience, I think one thing, this is maybe not quite what he's talking about, but I think it's important. One of the moves here throughout the hard problem debate is they make consciousness almost by definition into these primitive little bits. And they just don't put any structure there at all when they talk about it from the first person point of view. So they start with like red. And that never happens, right? Never. You probably can't even do that.
Can you unpack that a bit, Josh? What do you mean it never happens exactly?
So what happens is you have an experience of lots of stuff all at once. And there's all these complex interrelations and structures, and there's your memory of them and what you expect to happen. And it's all in play. And it's much richer. And that looks much more like, to me, like something that would line up with a brain. Because it's rich to begin with. It's complex. You wouldn't primitivize it and put it into atoms, right? And there's long traditions of people who have been making this point. It's kind of an empiricist way of thinking of just these very punctate kinds of visions of what the qualities and the properties that we care about are, which seems to greatly simplify them such that it does sort of sound like, yeah, they're so simple, I could just stick them in an atom. And I think that's just a mistake at the get-go. So, I don't think that's what the speaker was just saying. He was talking about something else. I think he was talking about whatever. But there's something in play here about the nature of the phenomena to be explained. And when you cook the books on that side, you say what needs to be explained is redness, or pure experience. Then, yeah, you're not. It's going to be hard to get a hold of. You're not going to be able to connect it to anything. But also, that doesn't answer to actual experience of people at all. It requires a theory of decomposition of experience. And there's a whole bunch of steps there to get that kind of weird explanandum, the thing you're trying to explain. Whatever that is. Explanandum. See, I went to grad school, but I don't remember what these words are. The thing you're trying to explain, if you make the thing you're trying to explain so mysterious, you won't be able to explain it. Surprise. So, but don't do that. Start with a richer picture, because the richer picture is there and it's been studied. So in phenomenology, but in lots of also just philosophy in general, where people are alive to these things. And then you have a picture that is much more relational and functional and lived in. in a way that's not going to sort of motivate you to put it into an atom.
Yeah.
Right.
I would just say about the point that Alex was actually making there, which I agree. I like the way Josh was pushing. And I do think it actually relates in a tangential way. But I would say to Alex's point is that that's not what the debate is about. Maybe that's what people are talking to him. But the point about the experiential aspect has always been that that's a way to pick out a phenomenon in the world, and then science tells us what its nature is. So that you may start off with the feeling of warmth, which, by the way, in science, it was a question of temperature from heat in terms of how much could something melt, like how much ice could it melt, and that was this heat in that sense, not an experience. So even about the history of the science, I'd say there's a lot of subtlety here that Alex is wrong about. But anyway, so and that's, we should be more scientifically literate about the history, I would say, because history of science is filled with these same debates happening over and over again. Frustratingly, one might think. But let me get,
wasn't it the idea that heat was actually a substance, like
caloric?
Yeah, caloric. Yeah.
So there's an irony here, because they were saying heat was more fundamental, and it turned out not to be.
Yeah, exactly. So I would just say that this idea that the experiential aspect, though, is just a way to pick out a phenomenon in the world. And then science tells us what its nature is. And the analogy that has always been, or at least should have been developed, at least by certain physicalists, is that maybe conscious experience is in some way a similar thing that lets us pick out something that we could then investigate its nature and find out that it was something physical. In the same way that we picked out something experientially, it seemed to be a flash in the sky, it seemed to be a feeling here. And then we go, oh, what it really is, though, is that kind of thing in the world. And then maybe it would also happen, so to speak, on the inside, is the hope of the physicalist. And so I just don't think that this way he's again sort of misinterpreting, I think, what the nature of the physicalist agenda is, or what's motivating it.
Right. Ken, any thoughts, or you want to move on?
I would just second what Josh was saying about, the actual structure of conscious experience, and not, there's no kind of, I think there's no a priori way to decide, like, what is always included in conscious experience and what isn't. And, obviously you can close your eyes, so you're not always seeing, for example, but if you kind of get more abstract and try to peel away different things, it doesn't seem like you're left with just the manifestation of red, or the manifestation of ouch, it seems like there's always some kind of structure involved, some kind of temporal flow, I would argue, some kind of spatial relational structure, and I would also argue some kind of self-awareness, some kind of reflexivity in that sense. And it's not clear how the panpsychist model, they can just help themselves to all of those and say, yes, like an electron has all of that, but that seems kind of, dubious. But it does seem to me like, the simpler you can get yourself to think a possible conscious experience, a minimal conscious experience would be, the more, the less implausible it is that, like, an electron has that. But you still, it seems to me, you owe us some kind of story about how the structure of experience gets realized in something, or how it's reflected in it. Like, would we be able to tell if, like, the electron has some kind of time consciousness, some kind of temporality, would or not? Like, what would be the difference? And it doesn't seem to me they can offer very much on that. So it's either like, help yourself to the whole structure, and then we're like, what? Electrons and pieces of paper are like thinking about their prospects.
No, and yeah, exactly. You get a free pass to say whatever you want, basically, or because you haven't said anything.
Yeah,
Right.
you could. Yeah, are they suffering? Or is it bliss? Like, the Vedantists, like, historically said it's bliss, and then the Schopenhauerians would be like, no, it's misery. What is the fundamental experience?
Well, I do think there's a related problem here, which is that a lot of these guys, want to say that there's some kind of rational coherence between your behavior and your experience. This is the harmony, the whatever, But the same must be true at the fundamental level, right? Because
You would
well,
think.
the electrons are behaving in a certain way. It must be rational or make sense for them. And so I do feel that they paint themselves in these really radical positions. People like Goff have kind of just endorsed that and said, yeah, they do tend towards the good, and there's a sense of purpose that they're striving towards, or in some sense. But I don't know how to square that with like their regular behavior of electrons and why they're so predictable. Why we can mathematize their behavior in certain ways. So yeah, the whole thing is. Once again, like if you could be a panpsychist and then you could give me some of the things that they demand from me, like they say, you are a physicalist, so explain why this brain state is pain, why that brain state is seeing blue. And I go, okay, like if I was a panpsychist, could I do that? And they go, well, we would wait for you to complete a theory of the brain, and then we would steal that and say that, but with something underneath it. And I go, oh, hi. Okay, then I'll just work on that. Like, it's fine. You know, that seems to me to be no real benefit in like signing up, except for that now I get to say, yes, there's something that you'll never explain. It's about me, and and I have heard people like Goffin is more, now that he's done some drugs, he's kind of a tourist in this way. Some of us old heads know, but he has now said things like the fundamental nature of reality is in us, and I'm in touch with it. And that's a mystical idea. And I say, that's fantastic. I've done drugs too, but like that can't be all there is to it. It's that it can't be. So yeah, I do think that there is really, I hate to keep drawing it back to anti-science, but I do really think that there is this drive towards like, science can't explain me. Science can't explain me, like the true thing I am. And that is what's driving a lot of these. There's nothing more, when you get down to the bottom of these arguments, there's nothing more than that I feel special. I seem like there's a specialness here. And I just think that's not a very serious thing to say. But I like these guys. They're serious, but they don't say this thing isn't.
I mean, if that's what's motivating them, it's a trivial sense in which that's true. Like science doesn't explain the particularity of anything, like that it's this instance or this token or something, It doesn't even touch that. It's kind of at a more general level. So yeah, it doesn't explain you exactly qua particular, this guy here now in this portion of space time. I mean, that's a mystery you can just cherish. But
well, there is a sense in which it would explain it if you had a complete theory of the brain and neuroscience and psychology, and I knew everything about your brain and psychology, then I would know you in the most intimate way possible, according to physicalism.
Yeah, but it still wouldn't explain you like qua instance. Like whatever it is that individuates you, whether it's, the particles themselves, like that's not really explained, it seems to me, in science. But that's not like, so what?
And let's move on, because we've got to get through some of these clips now.
Physics in the last century has just shown that everything is far more extraordinary than we can ever even hope to begin to understand. Wave particle duality. That why think that it isn't? It must be extraordinary in some way. So get over it.
I've made this point a few times recently when I've been considering panpsychism and idealism with people, and they sort of raise their eyebrows to the back of their head, and I say, look, it's a bit offensive to me that if I want to know what an electron is, for example, what its nature is, I could ask some quantum physicists, and one of them might say, well, it's an abstract cloud of probability whose wave function collapses when it's observed, and everyone goes, okay, yeah, interesting. One other person says, oh, it's an electron could be it is in fact in all of those different positions, and a new branch of reality is created for every single possibility, and there are trillions and trillions of multiverse realities being created every second, and people go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then someone comes along and says, I think there might be like proto-conscious properties, and everyone goes, you have lost your mind, haven't you? What are you talking about?
All right, Josh, what's the difference between positing panpsychism and positing like many worlds of quantum mechanics?
So it was just the thing I said at the beginning, that within the paradigm of the Galilean mathematization, we've reached some very interesting places. Schrodinger's equations, which are beautiful mathematical things, what do they say? Einstein was like, you can't say that. But it's within the math framework, and it's hyper predictively accurate. So using these models, we can predict things with an accuracy and at a scale that is unrivaled. So that's some justification. It's not perfect. We don't know what, is the cat alive or dead? I don't know, but it's got that. But when you stick consciousness into electron, what does that do? That's what Richard, especially, I think, has been harping on. It doesn't have these predictive properties. It doesn't offer us anything new. It doesn't offer us anything. It just says they're there, which is fine. Maybe that's the best we can do. I mean, sort of, modulo the right kind of Mysterianism here, but it's not like Schrodinger's equations, which lead to, among other things, like the atomic bomb, but whatever, it leads to lots of other things. It's fruitful. It's accurate in predictions that have not been made yet, that are then made and come out right. And I see nothing like that from the consciousness, the panpsychic side. So that's the difference.
All right. Anyone else got anything they want to add to that? Nope. All right. Let's move on to the next.
Solve that problem.
You got it. You got it, Josh. I'll just write everyone else out. Okay.
The first, I did want to say, I was waiting for Ken to jump in, so that's all my silence was.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I object to the characterization. No one acquiesced to mini worlds and like that, and no one just went, "Oh yeah, sure." There's no classical reality before you measure it. People violently resisted that. They still violently resist it, and they only are led to that because the evidence is so extraordinarily conclusive that something has to be going on. So, and yet we can't make sense of it. So. My own view is that you shouldn't be a many worlds person. You should just accept that reality at its fundamental nature is not classical. And that's the end of the story. It's just not classical. So, it's not woohoo. It's not magic. It's just not classical. So that's interesting. And maybe, that's how I would defend the view that coming from the sciences. But I don't like the way of characterizing that there's all these controversial things and people just accept them. And then there's this other controversial thing that people think is so controversial. But all of those things have been controversial. And then I would also add to that this really brings into focus something I think, which is again in the background of philosophy of science, which is what is the role, what is the job of science? So if you think the job of science is to decompose everything into little bits and explain how everything else arises from those bits, that's a classic paradigm, maybe been falsified by now to some extent. But if you think that's the way things work, yes, that's great. But there's another view about how science works, which is just that there isn't a fundamental level, that it's just kind of a mistake to think that there is a most fundamental level where all the questions will be answered and then you're done and there's a future complete science, which is just now we all go home, instead of an alternative view, which I think is at least as plausible, that there's always going to be further questions at a deeper level because your theoretical understanding is deeper. It opens up new questions for you. And then you'll be wondering about those questions. So I do think that there is this idea that yes, science is going to ultimately explain everything. And then I just think, well, but then there might be another set of questions. So it's going to get, maybe we'll get to about stuff about structural realism and stuff like that. But that's what I think a lot of in the background is going on, is that this assumption of fundamentality, that there's got to be a fundamental final stopping point where the tiniest bits are. And their idea is just that the tiniest bits are consciousness, yay. And it's just why tiniest bits at all is an alternative that I think should be, is a contender still. And we don't really know, for example, if it's turtles all the way down or if there's going to be a fundamental point at which it stops.
Right. Okay, let's go on to the next clip.
I think the biggest mistake is people think consciousness requires complexity. And the reason for that is because when you go looking for consciousness, people typically actually go looking for particular kinds of conscious activity, like memory and emotion and sentience, the ability to feel pain. And if something has those things, they go, oh, it must be conscious, right? But you could be conscious without having any of those things. Consciousness is just experience. You don't have to have memory. You don't have to have a sense of self. There could just be experience occurring. And when you strip away all of the complicated things that consciousness can sometimes do, you're actually left with something very simple. And if it's really something quite simple, it's easier to attribute it to an electron or something. That's where I think people are going wrong.
Ken, is it easy to attribute consciousness to an electron?
Oh, yeah. It's easy to attribute it to anything. But I mean, in the sense
Disney does. They get teacups
yeah.
of it.
Anyone can do it. Come on, let's all do it. Yeah, I mean, this relates to what we were discussing earlier, like what really is the kind of minimal structure of consciousness. We don't really know what the minimal structure of consciousness is, certainly a priori, and there's reason to believe that it involves some kind of complexity, like some kind of unification of multiple properties, like that's what drives IIT, for example. It may also involve reflexivity in some way, which in one way or another is tried to the higher order thought theories and self-representationalism and self-acquaintance theories try to capture that aspect. So that might be a necessary feature. It may also involve some kind of minimal temporality. So even if you lose your memory, you have very bad anterograde amnesia and so on, it may still involve a certain amount of time consciousness or temporality. We just don't know. So you can't just help yourself to the idea that it's so simple that even an electron could have it. Nor I think, you shouldn't, if we're talking about the phenomenology of it. So that's just one aspect. I mean, behind the phenomenology of it, it might be much more complicated than we can. So if you're committed to the view that I think Goff has, the revelation thesis, then it's sort of like, well, if you achieve the minimal phenomenology of consciousness by meditation or whatever, well, then you just know, like, that's all that's absolutely essential to it, period. Even if you could plausibly extract the minimal structure of consciousness from the phenomenological point of view, that doesn't tell you what its underlying real structure is. It may, not that the phenomenological structure is not real, it's just that it doesn't tell you everything about it. So underpinning that could be a whole lot of complexity that you don't have access to. And Goff and others just kind of help themselves to this revelation thesis.
Yeah.
So, let me just clarify for the audience this revelation thesis. So see if I've got it right, and you can correct me if I've got it wrong. But it's basically, I know what my conscious state is because I experience it. So because it's revelatory to me, transparent to me, then I have full access to it.
To its essential nature.
Yes. Right.
The essential nature. Yes. And I guess when you quibble with them, because I have a podcast, Consciousness Live, I've had some of these gentlemen on here actually, but I've had Goff on multiple times, and so when you press him on this, he wants to hedge a bit, and he'll say things like, "Well, look, insofar as you know what it's like to be you, then you know something about the essential nature of those properties that you're having, and you can just kind of tell that if they were physical, that would be revealed. It would be part of their essential nature." And that's the argument against. It's just literally that you can tell by having the experience. It doesn't seem physical. If it were physical, it would tell you. It would reveal it transparently. And so I think that what gives light to that whole project is the stuff that we've been talking about. Whether time consciousness is an important aspect, or whether there can be just a static moment, or as Alex says in the clip, whether you could have consciousness with no memory, which to me, it is not clear. Like I really struggle with the idea of like a instantaneous moment of consciousness with no memory. Like, what does that even mean? It's hard to be so glib and so confident. And then you talk to different people and they say different things. So some people say the quality of red is like the fundamental one. Then you talk to some meditators and they're like, no, these can be decomposed into bodily feelings and aspects in your gut, and you're like, huh, okay. And then others are like, no, there's something that you can dissolve those and realize that those. And so it's like, how could there be disagreement if there's something that's revealed insofar as you know what it's like to be you? And so I do really think that this question of complexity, simplicity, time consciousness, whether it's representational, whether there's something conceptual there, all of these debates are phenomenological. Like the old debate, do you hear a sound or do you hear the object that makes the sound? There's a huge debate in phenomenology about that difference, about the phenomenology of hearing the sound or hearing the object. and that's not resolved. So this idea that you can just help yourself to this thing that's known by everyone and then theorize about it is just, it's wildly optimistic. And that's why I always say, like, we got to understand both sides of the problem. The phenomenology side is not mapped out fully yet either. We don't have a full map of it. And that needs work. We need to work on that, as well as the neuroscience. We have two sides of it, and you can't neglect the subjective side, and you don't neglect the other side. So I do feel like they're neglecting both sides. The panpsychists, they're really doing a disservice to the phenomenological and the complexity that all this history and the issues and Ken knows way more about phenomena, the history of it than me. But just like as a practitioner of someone who's spent time doing phenomenology, they just seem to me neglect the whole complexity of it and the complexity of the science. So on both sides, it's a mistake. And then furthermore, just to rant some more, the question about what is its real ultimate nature, I tried to press this point by saying, look, Aristotle and Plato both knew what a triangle was. They both knew what the essential features of a triangle were. They both had the concept of triangularity, and yet Plato says there are no triangles in the physical world, and Aristotle says, yes, there are. So they disagree about the ultimate nature of triangles. But they both perfectly have the right concept. It's revealed. There's no mishmash, but it still leaves open this question: is that object over there really a triangle? Or so I think there's just a lot of there's a lot of deep philosophical issues that the way that they're presenting things in the hope of luring in a popular audience is papering over, and things need to be more complicated, but they can still be accessible. I mean, I don't know how accessible this mess we're presenting here is, but it's more serious, I would say, at least in the subject matter we're trying to address.
Right. Josh, actually, John, one thing I want to just ask you about, Josh, is one thing, it's often come up over many dinners with Alex, is that I ask him, okay, well, what does an electron experience then? And I never get an answer other than, oh, I don't know, man. To me, that feels like, okay, where's the theory?
I mean, so it might be they part of the move is to say, look, it's what he said. If a quantum mechanic says something very strange, you go okay, and if he said something very strange, we get all worked up. So he might say, look, I don't know what an electron feels, but it feels something, and he might appeal at that point to the kind of hey, I've gone as far as I can go, but it's not weirder than anything going on elsewhere. So, I get what he means. But for me, the point, that Richard just made is I think fundamental, that Galen certainly does it, and Philip, and they defend it as best they can. Obviously, I don't think their defenses work. They literally need a premise that says, I can tell what consciousness is and what it isn't. And that's what they mean by real. Remember the thing I said earlier, consciousness is real. What they mean is it's real in the way that it's revealed unto me. And it's revealed unto me to be non-physical in the sense of Galileo, of mathematizable physics, etc. So it might be physical in some other sense, which Galen makes, hay about, and which, but that's the issue. I think that, it's real, but it has hidden, complexity, hidden from the first person perspective. It's not evident it's not given, but we have theoretical reasons to think it's there. And we also think consciousness could be that kind of thing. It could be something that has some of it's revealed and some of it's not. And they reject that just outright. Go on.
Can I interrupt one second? Isn't it also true that the micro experience things, whatever they are, electrons, whatever, that their conscious nature is not revealed to me through my experience? So what's the difference?
Good question. Ken, you want to
well, I just want to say this is something that Luke Roloffs has realized. He has a paper on this. So he doesn't accept the revelation thesis because, at least not in its, in the Goff's way, because he realizes that, my own view is that my current experience is a combination of a bunch of experiences, but I don't experience it that way. I experience it as a unity, So he has a whole version of panpsychism that doesn't accept the revelation thesis, which seems to be somewhat in contradiction with Goff, because Goff uses the revelation thesis as the main bulwark for his version of consciousness fundamentalism.
Yeah. So Goff uses it because he thinks 2D semantics is too complicated for the ordinary person to understand. So he thinks this is a simpler version of, I mean, it's
Right.
true. So
Yeah, it's true.
it's just a really, that's why, yeah.
But I would add to that without the revelation thesis, 2D semantics is unmotivated. For the 2D semantic argument for it is really ultimately unmotivated. That's a long story.
Now, hang on. A lot
I
of
don't
people
think
won't
so, actually, about that. I disagree with that.
Okay.
hang on. A lot of people won't know what the 2D semantic argument is. This is from Chalmers, right? Yeah. So, does anyone want to unpack what the argument is, or is it too complicated?
Yeah, there's a sense in which when you say that something is possible, you have two different meanings that you could possibly say, one being epistemic and one being metaphysical. So you could say that how the world could have been given certain facts about it, how could it have been otherwise? And then you could say how the world could be just given what I know about it or what generally is known. You could specify relative to an agent, relative to science, whatever. So one of these dimensions is kind of an epistemic dimension where you say broadly that something is conceivable in the sense that it's sort of allowed by what you know. It fits with what other stuff that you know. So it's not contradictory in some sense. And so that sense of there being something conceivable says that it's just an epistemic fact about like, I can conceive the world being in such and such a way. But there's another sense of possibility and connected conceivability whereby you're not talking about just like, for all I know, how the world could be, but like how the world could have been otherwise, how it could have been different than it is. And there it looks like you're talking something more about the laws of the natural world and what's possible about it. So then the move basically is that once you clarify that, then their claim is that consciousness might not have been physical, that our world could have been such that there was no consciousness present. And then you get the question, okay, so why is there consciousness? And given that it might not have been that way. And so that's not an epistemic claim saying that I can conceive of the world as being that way, although you can use that to get to this claim, but it's a claim that our world could have fundamentally been different. And that's what motivates the hard problem, really, because if you really think that our world could fundamentally have been different in this way, then you really are motivated to seek an explanation for why it isn't that way. Like, why aren't we zombies, given that the world could have been literally a zombie world? So that's the two-dimensional way. The two dimensions are the epistemic and the metaphysical, and then they claim they're linked. So that's the crucial claim, is that you start with the epistemic, and then you work your way to the metaphysical. So it's a much more complicated scenario than simply saying, I'm in pain and it doesn't seem physical. Let's get a beer. You see what I mean?
Right. But to get the collapse of, the metaphysical and the epistemic with respect to consciousness, that's their move. So that the epistemic possibility reflects a metaphysical possibility in the specific case of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that for you to think that is the case, you need to accept something like revelation. Because
Chalmers thinks that you can do it without that, but you have to do some technical.
He does think that, but
modifying
I think,
of the first premise of the argument.
I think it's
probably too
not plausible.
Ideal primary conceivability.
Yes.
Right.
Then you just go, oh well, who has that? Jesus? Like, let's just ask Jesus.
The technical move is that he thinks that the primary and secondary intention don't need to coincide, so that you could have them come apart.
I am sure we have left all of your audience behind by now.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to move on to which is
about... didn't I? See, he's like at home, like, see, no one can understand this shit. See, blind neuroscientists, that's what you need.
Duck you, add Richard.
Right. Okay. Next clip is going to be really about the motivation for the Panpsychism project, I think.
I sometimes say physics is like playing chess when you don't care what the pieces are made of. When you're playing chess, you don't care. You just want to know what moves you can make. You might be playing with wooden pieces, plastic pieces. You might be playing online. Doesn't matter. The rules of chess sort of abstract away. And that's essentially what physics does. It doesn't tell us what an electron is. It tells us what an electron does. We're getting a more and more accurate tool for predicting the behavior of matter, but none of this is shedding any light at all on what matter essentially is, what the chess pieces of reality are.
By explaining that water is H2O, and then explaining what hydrogen is in terms of its atomic makeup, but then explaining the atomic makeup in terms of what it does, you haven't got a description of what water is. And so you could have a complete scientific picture of water, but you wouldn't know what the stuff actually is.
Instead of starting with physics and trying to get consciousness out, we start with consciousness and try and get physics out. And it turns out, for precisely the reasons we've been touching on, that's actually really easy to do. The reason it's easy to do is that physics is purely mathematical. And so, because it's purely mathematical, it's not really telling us what fundamental reality is. It's just describing its mathematical structure.
All right. So I guess the claim is then, okay, physics, they claim, doesn't tell us what fundamental reality is. So there's a gap to be plugged. We're going to plug consciousness in there. What fundamental reality is consciousness. Josh, why don't you react to this?
I mean, every time I hear this, I always think of the Bertrand Russell, it's theft over honest toil. You don't know what's in there. Stick the thing you want in there. You could put it in there, but what's lost in that move is that the method of doing, physics is what things do, has been super fruitful. It explains, kind of everything else. It may, reasonably, it's massively expansive. When
5% of everything else.
When you don't worry about the fundamental nature of things and just stick with this Galilean principle, you can explain, you can do all this cool stuff, like all of science. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the fundamental is. Okay, whatever, it does the job. Whatever's the thing that fits these laws. Now, the claim of the physicalists, as I see it, is we're applying that same methodology to consciousness. We applied it to biology. We applied it to chemistry. We're going to go to psychology and apply it there. And we don't need to know what the fundamental is. So long as we know what the little doodads do and how they combine, we can get everything. And they think, no, you can already tell that it's not that kind of thing because of revelation. And I just feel like now we're kind of caught in this circle here. Anyway, so I get it. They're right. In physics isn't going to tell you more than it tells you. But I just don't see what they can then help themselves to. I mean, so in a way, I'm kind of back to the first thing we were talking about. They're just plugging in what they already want. It's just circular. They're explaining consciousness by plugging consciousness in the bottom, and they don't even explain anything. They just plugged it in down there because there's a little space there to plug it in, I guess. And
and so I want to agree with everything Josh is saying, but then add to this because there's an unfulfilled promise here, which is that you can explain how the material world arises in some sense. And that is just gestured at wildly without any recognition that there's no explanation forthcoming. So yes, so the physics is mathematical. How can consciousness behave in a way, just pure consciousness, that's simple? That's just the simplest bit of consciousness that you can imagine. Simpler than that. Simple. So simple. How could that do what the equations of physics are telling us that these things do? There's no explanation forthcoming. So there's the Schrodinger equation. Okay, great. So now tell me how consciousness does that. Like, why does it evolve in such a way that this is the time evolved state is going to be this way or not? There's no explanation. It's just, well, it's mathematical. So you get it. Consciousness could be down at the bottom, but how? So we don't get that explanation. We're left with the same set of questions. Once again, we're just right back at the starting part. So the whole kind of, it's easy to explain the physical world, how rising out of consciousness is complete. I mean, it really is next to nonsense. It's complete. There's no rigor there. There's nothing except that the intuition that a structure can be realized by many different kinds of things. So maybe one of those kinds of things is consciousness. But there's no argument for that claim that pure consciousness can have any sort of structure. In fact, according to their view, it doesn't. So it seems like a mysterious sort of thing that this thing with no structure behaves in this completely structured way. and there's no forthcoming explanation for that. So I would reject all parts of this kind of very overly glib way of putting the panpsychist fruits here. They don't have the thing they claim to have at the end of the story. But then on top of that, I would add that there's just no reason to step over to that side of the fence. So the whole thing, once you like you hear the spiel and you go, okay, so we're going to explain how the physical world arises from consciousness, and then you hear physics is mathematical. Cool. Okay, so I don't think that works. But then added on to that is the whole Russellian picture about consciousness just tells us what physics does. What physical things does, not what they are. And I want to push back on that because one, I think the kind of ontic structural realist view that I like very much want to defend is the claim that no, it does tell us what it really is. It just is that set of mathematical relations. That's what's real. Right. So that's what science does. It tells us the real nature of these things. It's kind of wishful thinking to hope and wish there was something else that you could understand, which was the real true nature of this, instead of what science is telling us the true nature of it is, which is this relational thing. So now, is that all there is to it? Maybe, probably not. But at least we want to say that I would want to push back in those at least two ways.
Yeah, I was thinking that the whole chess analogy was weird because if you think about a bishop, what is a bishop? Well, it's the thing on the chessboard that moves according to those rules. There's nothing else more to say. Like, you could make a bishop out of anything you like. You can make it out of glass. You can make it out of metal. I had a jade chess set when I was a kid. You could make it look like, Lord of the Rings chess set, Star Wars chess set, the classic shapes. I mean, none of that is what a bishop is. The only thing that is what a bishop is what it does. Like, it moves in the way according to the rules of chess. That's it. You're done. That's a bishop. Am I right? I can see Josh is nodding his head. Josh.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but he's going to...
I'm a functionalist all the way down anyway. So
I mean, yeah, if you are,
I'm not saying everyone. Not everyone agrees with me, but that's totally what I think. So
I guess he thinks bishops must be made out of consciousness. Just like so. You want to know?
I hadn't thought that. My mistake. Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, sometimes they are when you play a game in your head.
That's right.
I once played against a grandmaster who played like 70 games all at one time with no board. He had his back to everyone and just like, without even facing, you would just call a move over and step to the next guy. I mean, beat everyone. So no board required, no physical bishop. But of course, Brian, I would say the bishop in that case was some neural state. But I guess what they want to say is that's a consciousness, doing that. And the functionalists sometimes have said this. The classic functionalists have been like, oh, we like functionalism because, even a non-physical substance can be functionally organized. And I've always been like, I don't know what that means. Does not compute. Like, non-physical substance organized functionally, following rules. Like, what does this mean? So
that's a good, right.
Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, I'm ranting at this point.
No, I kind of wanted to go on that if I could say something on this.
Okay.
Because, there are people like Donald Hoffman and his like crew or his collaborators who are trying to.
Yeah, he does.
I mean, his
don't run into him on a dodge hive, man.
The
projective geometry crew. Oh, they got rivalries with them.
That's right. Well, they want to derive all the physics out of some postulates about consciousness and
observers, not consciousness. Observers,
but and these have some structure. Otherwise, you can't go anywhere. Can't derive anything. But the thing is, and I asked him one time, like I said, well, like how many of these are there? Does it just take one, or like is the number? What determines the number of them? Like if there's a determinate fact about the number of them, that's not something that just consciousness accounts for. Like there's something other, there's some kind of objective fact that isn't consciousness dependent. And this is a kind of a problem that idealists and panpsychists historically always kind of run into. Like if you take Bishop Berkeley, speaking of bishops, Bishop Berkeley, for example, there's just minds and ideas. Okay, well, how do my ideas correlate with your ideas in the right way? Oh, God is doing that, right? And then God, according to what rules does God do it? Well, according to the archetypes of the material objects. And so now And then it's just like, what really did you gain by replacing the material objects with these ideas in God's mind, right? And another similar thing happens in the history of Buddhism with Yogacara Buddhism. How do like my ideas correlate with yours? It's karma's doing it instead of God. And it's always, they always need like some kind of objective backstop. So they can't really say that it's all just consciousness all the way down. So even if it is consciousness, it still has some kind of structuring elements that it doesn't create. So it's like, did you really gain anything by, you kind of had to give back with the one hand what you took with the other, with another hand what you took with the other, with one hand what you took with the other, So it doesn't sound like it's a real explanatory game. And by saying that consciousness is these are the kind of entities on which all of the relations are instantiated, well, we can make just as much sense of it by, as Richard was saying, having a kind of almost, pan-relationalist view of things, pan-structuralist view. Maybe all we need is structure, and structures have structures, and it's like structures all the way down. We don't really need any kind of substantial atoms.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think Josh didn't say something, but actually, I want to move on because we are getting a bit too long on this. So let's go to our next tip. And here, actually, Alex.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Yeah, I think this was earlier on when Alex was a bit more skeptical of panpsychism, and so I think he raised a really good objection here. So let's listen to it.
That I'm left with this problem of materialism. How can things that are not colorful, when you put them together and you stick them together, suddenly just become colorful? There seems to be no way to explain this unless let's just posit that the fundamental building blocks of the universe just are color. There we go. Problem solved. Materialism makes no progress on telling us, how we get to color. But this view, pan-colorism or whatever, it answers the question easily. Well, we get colorful things because the fundamental substance of the universe is color. It seems, should we say, rash for me to say, therefore, I think the fundamental element, like color is primary, out of which we describe material objects, rather than materialism being primary, out of which we describe color. You probably think that view is a bit ridiculous. You'd probably ridicule me if I took that seriously, but isn't that something like what's going on here with consciousness, or with your view of consciousness, with panpsychism?
So, I guess I would resist that it's merely an assertion. I mean, you could
panpsychism of the gaps, if you like.
Right, panpsychism of the gaps. That's I guess you can think of it as an inference to the best explanation, perhaps. I mean, even with empirical inquiry, I think people sometimes have an oversimplistic idea of it, like we just, do the experiment and find the data and that's it. I mean, maybe a somewhat helpful analogy might be ancient history, because obviously ancient history, it's dead and gone. We can't sort of just go and observe ancient Greece or whatever. So we have to work with the evidence we have. And we look at the different hypotheses, and we do a kind of inference to the best explanation. The human epistemological situation is sadly very frail. It's nice if you don't, again, I love science. It's nice if we can settle something with an experiment, but we do the best with what we have.
All right, Josh, I thought this was a good objection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very nice exchange, and makes the point we've been ranting on about it very clearly. And the response is kind of like, oh, well, no, it's an inference to the best explanation. He's pulled back to a considerably weaker epistemic claim, which is good. I applaud that. It's just once you've done that, you're now in the mix with a bunch of other things. And I wrote in saying, oh, well, I think the fruitfulness and the historic success of the Galilean approach, recommends it. So I take the best explanation to be that consciousness looks simple, but it's not. In fact, it fits in with the Galilean picture. And now we're fighting about who's got the simplest explanation, which is kind of where I think science does go, especially in cases where things are really underdetermined. We already said it's very hard to say what the data to be explained is here, whether it's simple, whether it's complex, whether it's got time and reflexivity in it. So we're in a place where things are relatively underdetermined even for science, and we're fighting about what's the best explanation. And that's going to have a bunch of different factors. And those factors are partly kind of sometimes what you write in with. One of the things I was going to say earlier, I think all of us to some degree here are committed to a kind of naturalism to some degree, that we really think science does get to kind of dictate in some way, or anyway, it's got standing for explanatory purposes. And when we don't, and what Ken has been saying, look, when science hits a wall, you don't just make something up. You just say, I don't know. If you're a naturalist, you say, we've hit the end of naturalism. And I take it, though, Philip, whatever, as being very, he sounds normal. That really, he's a metaphysician in a stronger sense. And I think Galen, so there's and I know Luke, there's a play with a fair bit of the panpsychics. If they're willing to jump, for my money, the metaphysical shark, they're going to go a little farther out than I'm willing to go. When my science stops, I'm kind of like, I want to make it fit. If I can't, I'm going to do what Ken said and just say, hey, I don't know what to say. Whereas they're like, all right, let's go. Jump the shark. Let's make up a bunch of crazy shit. Sorry. And they're happy. Yeah, and good. And they're happy about that. And for me, I'm not happy. I'm like, well, I think we no longer know how to even decide what a right answer would look like at this point. We're making it up. You can make up what you want, but you're not going to get anything out of that. And so there's some deep divide there about it. Anyway.
Can I just, I want to agree with everything Josh is saying, but then also add that the typical move from their side at this point would be to say, look, we're just trying to find the simplest, best explanation that takes account of all the data. And by the way, parentheses, some of the data is that there's this unexplainable non-physical stuff hanging around that only I know about. So, we're trying to get the best theory that explains that. And it's that move really is doing a lot of work, because if you're just looking for the best theory, then there's a lot of them, but they will say those theories don't account for the data. So that's why I think it's very important for physicalists to make a loud, obnoxious show of saying, no, we take consciousness seriously. It is real. They can't accuse everyone of being an illusionist. And the only two options in the universe are not illusionism and panpsychism. There's also a middle ground of just regular physicalism that takes consciousness seriously, says it's physical. And that hasn't been refuted or shown to be silly. It's merely not satisfying intellectually to people who have a certain view about what that kind of satisfaction would amount to. And that's a completely different thing. So I think that's an important, to stay our ground here and say consciousness is real. We agree. You can't take that from us. It is real. I'm a person. I know just as much as you. I'll bang every table, slam, bang, bam, consciousness. But that can't be all there is to showing it's not physical, because I just don't, it can still be physical. It probably is. So, we want to just end on that. Yeah, sorry. Yes.
Ken, is it a case of bad,
go ahead.
Is it a question of like bad induction? I think we talked about before. I know I'm conscious. So to explain that, I'm going to assume everything in the universe is conscious. It feels like not a very simple move to make.
Well, that's why I think I told you once, it's a little bit like the logic of multiverse explanations of you can look at it that way. Like, why do we have this weird world? Oh, well, we have all of them. Oh, okay, that would explain why we got this weird one. So why is this like chunk of matter over here conscious? Oh, all of it is. Oh, yeah, okay. Well, that would explain that, wouldn't it? Yeah. And
so they're doing the inverse gambler's fallacy too. That's what you're saying.
That's right.
Everyone's a winner. Everyone's a winner.
That's one way to look at it. And then you could say, well, okay, is that the argument to the best explanation? No. Relying on the revelation thesis and so on, that makes it sound like, no, this is something quasi a priori. So if it's not technically a priori, it's at least like it's in that direction. And here it's like, no, this would just be the best explanation of everything that we observe. And they go, like, really? It would be an explanation of why I'm conscious. Yes. But those kind of like likelihoods, if you like, or to speak in Bayesian terms for a second, those are pretty cheap,
I don't think this is true though, because Ken, just like I've long thought that you could have panpsychist zombies just as much as any other kind of zombie. So why couldn't there be a microphysical duplicate of me that had no conscious experience like mine at all, like the table over there, according to certain views? And then I almost wrote a paper on this, and then guess what I found out is that this is actually Philip Goff's first paper. His very first publication makes exactly this argument, where he says you can have, and he wrote it under when he was a student of Galen's, and he was trying to argue against Galen, saying panpsychism is rubbish. I guess that's how you guys say it over there, right? Over here we just call it bullshit.
Rubbish.
Exactly. Anyway, so then I was like, I don't need to write this paper because it's already been written as part of the, as part of the canon already. That this is done. And then lo and behold, Philip's out there saying, oh no, I solved the problem that I raised in my paper. I just postulate psychophysical laws that connect the micro phenomenal properties to the macro ones. Boom, rabbit out of the hat. I have a career, I guess, as a panpsychist. To me, it's just it's the most amazing thing that you could convince yourself of, because it doesn't really solve the problem. It introduces all this extra machinery. You're doing backflips at that point to really avoid taking anyway. So yeah, I do think that it's not obvious that it would explain why I'm conscious, because you get this problem. Why can't I be a zombie? Like, what is it that stops me from not having the kind of conscious experience that I have? And they don't have an answer.
At least they need you're right. You would need to add to that, not just that everything is conscious, but everything is conscious is distributed in such a way that I as this unit am conscious, and this, you also need a solution to the combination problem, I guess.
Well, the view that Philip arrives at is just kind of bizarre, in my opinion. Is that there's these non-reducible fundamental subjects that emerge in reality, and then they just subsume the background states of consciousness of the universe, and that is my mind.
Yeah, that's
it's like an overlap view or something. And I just think this is where you've led yourself to avoid just saying it's something about the brain. Like you don't want to. Can we do some? It just seems to me so strange. But on the other hand, people explore what they want, and I'm happy that there are smart people painting themselves into these corners, because then we can just shine the light over them and be like, "There's the corner."
So is the view? I mean, you can tell me. I mean, is the view that there are consciousnesses of consciousness tropes or something, of blue and of red and of pain, just filling up the universe, and then somehow they just how do they coalesce into my current experience? And is that
I think his
sort of
view is
selected
that
by
there's the background mind, the universal consciousness of the mind, which has all these experiences, and then my mind partially overlaps with that, and I have some of its experiences that are now mine, because anyway. So I'm probably not doing justice to it. It's not my view. I just think that it's a lot of work to do to simply say, now I understand consciousness, and then you're left with this convoluted thing where do I understand any of this at all? It's very mysterious to me.
All right. Let's move on. Going to finish things off with a quote from the book. This is about the ethical implications of panpsychism. So basically, Philip Goff talks about the climate crisis, something I very much agree with him on. And now, what are the implications for panpsychism? Quote, panpsychism has the potential to transform our relationship with the natural world. If panpsychism is true, the rainforest is teeming with consciousness. As conscious entities, trees have value in their own right. Chopping one down becomes an action of immediate moral significance. Moreover, on a physicalist worldview, humans have a deep affinity with the natural world. We are conscious creatures embedded in a world of consciousness. We treat other humans not as objects, but as sentient centers of value and purpose. We feel their presence when in close proximity, and we instinctively interpret their actions as flowing from their individual agency. Imagine if children were raised to experience trees and plants in the same way, to see the movement of a plant towards the light as expressing its own desire and conscious drive for life, to accept the tree as an individual locus of sentience. For a child raised in a panpsychist worldview, hugging a conscious tree could be as natural, as normal as stroking a cat, close quote. So who has any thoughts on this? Ken, let's start off.
Well, I mean, the problem is going to be, what about we need to know what the boundaries are supposing is true. Like, are we going to also be like, you've offended your teacup, my friend?
Right. My screwdriver is very angry. Right.
You've offended your screwdriver. I think you owe it an apology. I mean, I'm worried that we get back to
I
kind of
the opposite kind of reaction because one, I'm a vegan for moral reasons for animals because I think these things are important. And one time I was at a conference and Philip was eating a chicken by me, and I was like, "Yo, why aren't you vegan? Like you should be vegan given your views and all the things that you've said." And he was joking, but he often deflects in this way. He said something to the essence, "Everything's conscious, and you got to eat something in it." And I was like, "What a callous thing to say!" Actually, in my opinion, that's. I mean, he was probably trying to avoid having an actual conversation about it, but to me, it was just very symptomatic of like So I want to push the opposite way. Actually, I think physicalism is much more conducive to these kinds of things, and the science of plants and cognition wise has become very sophisticated, and they are much more creatures of the world than we could have thought. They are active in ways that we couldn't possibly imagine. You don't need panpsychism. You don't need fairies in the garden and all of this, stuff to make the world a magical and wonderful place that a kid would want to be mystified and amazed by, because the actual physical world is magical enough in its actual function. Trees are amazing. They're much more complicated than we ever gave them credit for. And panpsychism had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So one thing that got me actually was this bit of the quote where it says, "We treat other humans not as objects, but as sentient centers of value and purpose." But I'm like, but hang on, you just said everything is conscious. So objects are also conscious. So then what's the problem with treating humans as objects? Right?
You got to eat something. You got to eat something.
Somebody.
I've actually argued that humans should become photosynthetic, and that there's an actual problem from the argument of evil here, that if there was an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect being, that he would have created human beings photosynthetically, and that we would have had the taste of bacon from afternoon sun or morning sunlight, and no pigs needed.
Yeah.
So I do think like the absence of photosynthetic animals, generally speaking, is a real problem for any sort of ultimate creator.
And stuff on the problem of animal suffering, and I think we've kind of boiled it down to, why does bacon have to taste so good?
I've never had bacon, so I wouldn't know, but I hear people often say.
I only eat fake bacon now. I did have bacon.
You can,
even though I thought
Can I just make a plea for
bacon?
No, the bacon problem is a serious problem. But you might think that panpsychism is pushing in the wrong direction in some sense, because it'll undermine valuing, macro levels, ordinary sized humans and their interests, and in favor of, and this is a big debate in ethics overall. How do you value, some part of some non-sentient part of the land versus peoples and their interests, and so I worry a little bit about. I mean, I share the general, caring, though I do eat things that I probably shouldn't, but I feel like maybe this is going to devalue people, and now you might say, well, they're all people, but this is not a person. And if your theory says it is, from a moral perspective, I think you've made a mistake. Like this does not have the value of a tree, right? So there's a distinction that they have to draw somehow between things that matter and things that don't. It's not going to merely be consciousness, because that's everywhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And if it is everywhere and our actions somehow affected, we have no idea how. Like maybe things want to be eaten. Maybe the trees are silent scream to be cut down, or like we have no way of guiding our
misery. In a serious note, though, like you say that jokingly, but if you talk to like indigenous cultures and people who have done like certain kinds of drugs like ayahuasca and stuff, they will say things exactly like that. Like the plants, they want us to interact with. They want to be eaten. They desire to be spread, and it's a symbiotic relationship. I've actually talked to people who deeply hold these beliefs. So this is something that people say. Now, I don't think plants have that kind of consciousness. I'm not saying that they have spirit minds or anything like that. But there is a sense in which there is a natural. I'm going to rant now being a vegan, but we have to cut ourselves from food in such a strange way, because it is kind of the natural cycle that you go and you eat something, then the animal defecates, it spreads the seeds that way. Humans have completely removed ourselves from that cycle.
Yeah,
We don't
that's
like
true.
that. We make our seeds separately. We sterilize our defecation. We don't want the two ever mixing. So we are really removed from the natural cycle of things. And I
That's
do
true.
think that that kind of Goffian idea that we should be more into nature is not bad. But you don't
I
need
agree.
panpsychism to get to that
Yeah,
point.
completely
Right, but you
agree.
don't need, yeah, exactly, because the thing is, they're not, as I understand it, you correct me if I've got this wrong, the claim is not that everything has the consciousness that we have. There's some very basic consciousness. So
Yeah.
panpsychism wouldn't get you that animals are conscious of plants. That would have to be done some other argument, right? So you can't get, that you should be hugging trees on panpsychism. There's just, it doesn't even follow.
Not
Right.
from panpsychism, alone. Yeah. And then
Right.
the other premises you would use are things that a non-panpsychist could use, like we should care about the forests, we should care about other sentient beings that we know are sentient for sure. We should
Right.
not be, I don't know,
And it may be that
jerks.
they need to solve the combination problem to have
Yeah.
answer these moral questions. They don't already have that answer sitting there. It's part of their answer to the combination problem about which things rise to the level of whatever, which was one of the complaints we had in the beginning about the theory.
Yeah.
And do they have to fill out, like, what is the nature of the conscious experience of the electrons or whatever they think has this space? Because I said to Alex in this debate we did in Oxford, I said, well, look, if I take the view that a brain is what's, I don't know if I want to use the word generating consciousness, but, is conscious, whatever, however you want to phrase it, then I can look at my cat and say, yeah, I have moral consideration for my cat, right? But if I sever that, and say, no, okay, consciousness may be everywhere. How do I know that I shouldn't be treating objects like a screwdriver with moral concern? I just can't make moral decisions anymore, because if I can't distinguish between the things of moral concern and things of not moral concern, I don't know how to even act in the world. And so you need to tell me then, what conscious experience does the electron have? And if you can't do that, I don't even know how you can make these kinds of statements about ethics. It seems bizarre to me.
Agreed.
All right. Well, look, let's leave it there. If you have your own thoughts, please leave them in the comments. And if you like this material, please like and subscribe. It just takes me to thank our panel, Rich, Ken, and Josh. You guys have been amazing. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours and hours more, but we will leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.